the senator, while indoctrinated, could not explain his toxicity.
You should not listen to men's rights advocates if you want to know what they have to say.
Number ZZ9 plural Z alpha. Number ZZ9.
I said I've never seen such hideousness in all my life.
There's a lot of this,
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Like a furry torpedo to the jugular. This is Honey Badger Radio. Radio with Buddy.
But the senator, while indoctrinated, could not explain his toxicity.
You should not listen to men's rights advocates if you want to know what they have to say.
Number ZZ.
Hello and welcome to HBR Talk 277, Two Things Experienced by Over a Third of Kenyan Men. I'm your host, Hannah Wallen, here with Nonsense Annihilator Lauren Brooks and the personification of perceptivity, Mike Stevenson, and tonight we're going to examine an article from The Nation about Kenyan men's experiences of partner violence and one more thing. But first before we get to that, we gotta do what we gotta do. As always, Honey Badger Radio dishes out a smorgasbord of thought-provoking discussions, and as experiences, both recent and long past, have demonstrated, the provoked thoughts are fighting back. They've made it clear that for people like us, relying on third-party payment platforms, 30 parties sounds like a little bit much, especially for somebody my age, like Patreon to fund our work, is treading on thin ice, or building our house in the path of a rapidly growing wildfire. In light of this, we strongly encourage at least our supporters to switch at least their support for us to feedthebadger.com, the most stable way to help us out. And if you want to tip us directly instead of relying on any social media platforms tip jar, the link for that is feedthebadger.com/justthetip. And as always, the same risk applies to our social media platforms, which is why you should further provoke the thought police by tracking our thought-provoking discussions on honeybadgerbrigade.com, where you can find your way to all of our content, as well as a link to feedthebadger.com in the drop-down menu at the top of the page. And there we go. There's the how to contact and how to help out. And we do tweet out the link to the blog post for the show every week as well. So to see that on Twitter or X or whatever it's being called now, then you need to follow Honey Badger Bite. That's Honey Badger, all one word, with the word bite, B-I-T-E, at the end of it at Twitter. And that's basically it. So we've talked about this topic quite a bit in regard to the United States, Canada, the UK, a little bit in India. We've talked about Deborah Pawnee's research on coercive control, and how she found by surveying worldwide that this is a widespread problem in many countries. But I ran across this article the other day, and I thought, we probably ought to look into it. And this is statistics. I believe the research cited in this is actually a Kenyan government thing, like our NISVS, just from what I was looking into about it. So here's the article, and I managed to scroll down for some reason, but a third of Kenyan men are mistreated by their partners. And, we hear about how many women are victims of partner abuse. And we hear about what percentage of partner abuse in Western countries is known to be perpetrated by women. But we don't think about, as a society, how many male victims that means. Right? And this basically, like 1 out of every 3 Kenyan men has experienced some form of partner abuse.
One in every 3 has reported.
Yeah, has reported. So, and see, that's the other thing, because there's 2 things that they experience here. So the article is really blatant and open about describing the first thing. So we'll see if you guys can figure out the second thing as I read through. And I'm not going to read the bullet points because I think those are also stated again later in the story. Every time I read those, then I end up rereading them later. More than a third of Kenyan men have experienced intimate partner violence. The recently released 2022 Kenya Demographic and Health Survey indicates that 36% of men have suffered economic, psychological, physical, or sexual violence at some point in their relationships. And that's the first thing I want to point out. When feminists hear this, they always ignore, like we've mentioned here, 4 things, right? Economic, psychological, which is emotional, physical, and sexual violence. They will ignore 3 of those things, focus on the psychological, and talk about it as though psychological abuse doesn't matter when it happens to men. But the reason that psychological abuse gets counted as domestic violence is because feminists fought very hard to have that included in the law and to have it included in the types of domestic abuse that women's shelters and women's organizations address, right? So it matters when it happens to women. So if it matters when it happens to women, it matters when it happens to men. If it matters when it's done to women, it matters when it's done by women. So any of our hate listeners that are sitting there saying to themselves, well, this is all about psychological abuse, You can shut up right now, because there's 4 things mentioned, and all 4 of them are deemed legitimate when women experience them. Men in urban...
There's a reason. There's a reason psychological is the most controversial of them, because there's no scars from that. There's physical scars. I guess there's sexual scars, or at least there's forensic evidence of that kind of damage, and there's economic evidence of economic abuse. But you can't really prove psychological. It's all he said, she said, and whatnot. But like you said, if it's viable when it's done to women, it's viable when it's done to men. If it's not, it's not. So we can put an asterisk next to psychological. But the other 3 are, very, very much important.
Yeah. Well, and I'll point out, people who are raised in violent households, abusive households, or who have experienced trauma throughout, say, their childhood. So, say, the children of men who experience domestic violence, or the children of women who experience domestic violence, and especially the children in two-way violent households, or extreme violent households, or households where it's very obvious from the way they talk to each other that the parents don't love each other at all. That actually damages a part of your DNA called the telomeres, and your aging process occurs. The deterioration that's part of your aging process, skin wrinkles from skin cells not reproducing correctly, or from the elasticity being lost, the loss of connective tissue and stuff like that, that results from those telomeres being shortened over time. They're sort of like a buffer at each end of your DNA. And as those shorten, you look older, you feel older, you start to have more physical pain, you start to slow down, you get fat more easily, those kind of things. And it also affects your cognition, your emotional toughness, resilience, and stuff like that. And so, in a household, for instance, where one partner is constantly belittling and haranguing, browbeating the other, even if there's no punches thrown, even if there's no slapping, kicking, even if voices are never raised, you just, you notice that the individual being mistreated is stressed all the time, and is walking on eggshells around their partner, and their partner is constantly cruel, right? All those things affect the children. So your kids are heavily impacted. Their lives are shortened. Their future health is impacted. Their psychological health is impacted. The way that they form ideas about how relationships should work is impacted. So even if we turn around and said, well, women behaving that way toward men, we don't care. If we didn't care about that, you're still looking at all of those kids in those relationships, all of those families raising children that are going to be impacted for the rest of their lives by this. But if that happens just from witnessing that, though, imagine what happens to the individual who's experiencing it. Right? If growing up in a violent environment or growing up in an abusive environment shortens your lifespan, imagine how much more it shortens it being the person who suffers abuse. And that's not gendered.
Yeah, and that's also the kind of psychological damage that feminists and women will ignore, right?
Mm-hmm.
They don't care about what the kids go through, but that even if the children are never like sexually abused or physically touched, that psychological abuse that happens, because it does happen in when they're raised in homes that are unstable in that way, they don't care about that. They don't care about that. I was doing what I had to do. Oh, your father was this, that, and the other. It's always the blame game, and it's ridiculous. Just
Oh
The
yeah.
kids are the ones that suffer.
And if you really want to, you really want to get into what happens with kids raised in those environments and what happens with living in a long-term environment like that. Um, and one thing to look into is complex PTSD. And we understand PTSD through its symptoms. It is a natural response to extreme circumstances, or to circumstances that are crazy, basically. So you're sane if you have PTSD. It's considered a mental health condition, right? And it's also a physical health condition because there are physical symptoms of PTSD. But complex PTSD is a little harder for people to get a grasp on, because it's not necessarily from an incident that was traumatic, and it's not necessarily from things like being in a war zone, in combat. It's from a lifetime of repeated traumas that create in the individual a response where they have the same trauma response as PTSD, where they're hyper alert, they're constantly expecting another trauma, they're unable to interact normally with other people because of the types of traumas they've had. They have triggers, they have flashbacks, they have all of, they may react to situations abnormally, specifically because it harkens back to something that they don't even realize was that traumatic. And I've been very close to people who were raised in environments like that, and whose responses to things like an ordinary argument or a heated debate over, should we do this or should we do that? And I think this is dangerous and that's safer. I think that's more going to be more beneficial to us. It might be worth the risk, that kind of thing, where they have more difficulty treating that as not being a battle. Treating it as, well, we're hashing out these ideas and we're still going to be friends when it's over. There's a lot of that. And so when we talk about this type of psychological or emotional violence, that's something that is very misunderstood, I think, by a lot of people. And they like to refer to it as just hurt feelings. And I don't think people understand the level to which that can go. Things like somebody constantly or frequently, threatening to abandon their partner in an environment where that abandonment would come with significant financial loss and create a significant barrier to other family relationships, like the relationship with the children. It's a lot more traumatic to have your spouse threaten to divorce you if that threat comes with those consequences, right? And you can't just move on to another person and still have the same life. They're threatening to actually wreck your whole life over and over again. You have people being torn down all the time by their partners, belittled, humiliated in front of other people. And that's what's sort of described here. Psychological
and there's kind of two different ways of doing this.
Oh yeah.
One way we often see it is when a woman says, even in the company of her male partner, all men are the same. All men are immature. Men can't multitask. Men can't deal with colds and stuff, and they say all this about men in general, and her male partner just has to sit there and listen to this, just hoping she totally doesn't mean me. And a lot of the times they don't, because a lot of the times, particularly feminists, have this way of talking about all males, all men, but they don't mean their family, because when pressed upon this, they will say, well, I don't hate men. I have a husband. I have sons. I have a father.
I own several. I don't hate them.
Yeah.
It's much like I don't hate black people. Some of my best friends are black. Apparently that's racist. But when you say the equivalent thing about men, it's not sexist. but like I say, that's one way of approaching it, and some women really do have this disconnect. Like they do genuinely love the men in their lives, but they hate all the other men.
They married the one good man.
Right.
Yes. Well, it's that those other men that she's never met, they aren't legally obliged to look after her.
There
It
you
just
go.
so happens that the men who aren't legally obliged to look after her are the ones she thinks are all scumbags, but she loves the men in her life. And
Yeah.
then there's this other thing, this thing that we're focusing on in this article, that some women really are prone to relational aggression, as we call it. They might not even hate all men, but they particularly hate the men in their, well, they particularly demean the men in their lives, and they don't do it like male friends do with each other, like they just rib each other for the bants, basically. When certain women do it to the men in their lives, it goes beyond the bants. It's that they're so preoccupied with wearing the pants in this relationship that they have to keep demeaning the men closest to them, and that's in a way even more sinister. And it's not even feminist in nature. Like I say, it's relationally aggressive in nature. They lash out against particularly the men in their lives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there are ways that you can psychologically abuse someone that people don't think about, that are particularly harmful in that they affect the individual's view of themselves and their view of their reputation, their level of confidence in everyday interactions, their level of confidence in their careers, and so on. Like putting your disloyalty on display by letting it be known, not just cheating, but letting it be known publicly that you're doing it, right? Or being publicly affectionate toward people of the opposite sex that are not your partner in a way that is over the top, not just like hugging all your friends, male and female, in a group that everybody does that, but, you know, kissing on them, holding hands with somebody that's not your partner, you know, anything that isn't the usual, like, we're buddies as a group, where when we say hello and goodbye, we do these things in addition to the greeting. And that really can be damaging, actually, to both sexes. And I've seen that happen as well. You know, if a woman were subjected to years and years of a man degrading her just by over and over again making nasty comments about her appearance and her weight and her attractiveness, you know, like you couldn't get anybody else's attention, you had to settle for me, that kind of thing. Feminists would immediately acknowledge that that's abuse, and that's going to affect everything in her behavior, and can even drive someone to suicide. But when a woman does it to a man, and the man complains, they turn around and say, well, you know, his feelings are just hurt. But men care about their appearance. Men care about their attractiveness. Men care if their partner is attracted to them. They're human beings. Of course they care about those things. And we're just supposed to ignore that. So the article says, men in urban areas are more likely than their rural counterparts to encounter at least one form of violence, psychological or emotional violence, including humiliation in front of others, threats to hurt or harm, and that's another one. Somebody says, you know, one of these days, I am going to sock you right in the jaw, and they mean it, you know. One of these days, Alice, pow, right in the kisser.
Yep.
Like, and it's funny on TV when you know that it's just an expression of frustration and he doesn't mean it. But, you know, The Honeymooners was really a show about a verbally abusive relationship if everything they said was in seriousness, if they were mean to each other in seriousness. And if you take everything seriously in that show, it's very depressing. And, I watched it as a kid and found it to be so because I didn't get that the gags were all, them being affectionate by poking fun at each other. I'm going to tear your arm off and beat you with it, like, and like Karen's family kind of does that, but it's all, joking around. Nobody's serious about it.
Yeah.
But when it's serious, it becomes scary.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I was just gonna say I watched that show. I loved that show, and I totally got it. It was kind of like the preempt to the Roseanne show.
Yeah.
Right? Like just the you give as good as you get. And as much as Ralph gave, Alice gave just as much.
Mm-hmm.
She had some good ones. She had some good singers in there. It's a really good, funny show. But I can see how if you don't really understand the framework of it, it's like, why are people? How can you be like this? You know what I mean? This doesn't seem normal.
Yeah, well, and like if you don't notice how affectionate they are to each other physically, it kind of, and as a kid, that went over my head. Oh, they're physically affectionate. They don't mean any of the things they're saying. It's like, oh, this thing just jumped on me. Dang it. Because I wasn't interacting with the page. Okay. Sorry. So in addition to, threats to hurt or harm, when it means that it says serious threats, insults or belittlement was the most prevalent, with 25% of men having endured it at some point. And again, got to remind you, this is men having reported that they've endured it.
Right.
Additionally, 19% of male respondents, shared that they had experienced this form of violence within the year preceding the survey. Weighing in on the statistics, I'm going to butcher this name, I'm sorry. Not Alan, but I think this is Kutsushi. I think I'm supposed to pronounce all the letters. So Alan Kutsushi recalls how he experienced emotional violence without knowing it until much later when a friend described what he had gone through. It's always how she would demean me. It was always how she would demean me no matter what I did for her, and how she constantly compared me with other men, reminding me what her ideal type of man was, which apparently was not me. And just that alone, I don't think people realize how common that is. If you look at relationships in Western culture, for instance, like, there's never a time when men are not compared to each other in terms of relationships, and you get treated like a deadbeat for not being as good of a protector, provider, affection shower, ass kisser as the next guy, right? If you're not giving her big enough Valentine's Day gifts, if you didn't buy a big enough engagement ring, right? You didn't spend enough months' salary on a symbol that doesn't really determine whether you are in love or not. If your provision isn't enough that her living environment is luxurious enough, if your provision isn't enough that you guys can go on vacations, if she has to work, women will belittle their men over all of those things, right? And women will belittle each other's men and the wife will not defend, and they'll get together in groups and gossip about their partners. Well, they got to one up. My husband does this. Well, my husband does this. My husband leaves his underwear on the floor. Well, my husband's underwear on the floor has skid marks. Well, my husband's skid marks won't even come out with bleach. And then it just gets worse and worse. Like, I don't think he even wipes his butt. Whatever. Like, it gets that bad. And I've sat and listened to this and gotten castigated for other women for not joining in. And I'm like, well, I really like my husband. I don't know why you guys got married if you don't like your husband? What's the matter with you?
Right.
But that does happen a lot. Women marry a man they don't like because money, or because they didn't think they could find somebody more compatible with them, or because they don't like anybody.
Well, women typically marry because they think that things will get better. They think that the situation will improve.
Yeah.
Men marry women hoping things stay the same. Right? They hope she never changes. Oh my God, this chick is great. Just stay the same. you know?
Yeah.
And both are unrealistic for many reasons, but that's typically how it goes. You
Yeah.
know?
And it's sad because you partner up with somebody when you should be partnering up with somebody when you have compatible values and compatible interests and a lot of trust. Like, you have to be able to trust each other to also have not overlapping interests and compromise where your values don't match and things like that. But I think a lot of abuse happens because women partner with men that they don't like, which, like, I just don't. I don't know why you would do that to your partner or yourself. I think there are women that fall in love with men they don't like.
I think it's time to introduce the term fixer-upper.
Yeah.
But this is largely what a lot of women are attracted to. It's, I can fix him.
Yes, I can change him.
Yeah, they don't want a man, they want a project.
Yes.
And they just hope for the best, that the project works out for the best. And like maybe 5% of the time it does. But the other 95% they're like, well, shit, I couldn't fix this human being into being a good human being.
For me.
Yeah, that's
me,
the thing.
yeah.
Women frequently try to fix men who are not broken.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's not that he's immature. It's that his interests in entertainment differ from yours. Like, he likes to enjoy stories that he can participate in. You like to enjoy stories that you read or that you sit and watch on television, but maybe you don't like stories that you can participate in. So maybe you shouldn't marry a gamer, or video gamer or tabletop gamer. And that was what one of the divorces that I've seen among friends growing up, and it was an abusive relationship, by the way, and she entrapped him with a fake pregnancy, and then later humiliated him by putting her disloyalty on public display and then abandoning him. And they had a contentious custody battle and everything. So we're talking, incompatibility. This woman married a man she didn't like. She was much taller than him, and she treated his height as a flaw, as though there's something wrong with guys just because they're not tall.
Like you didn't know that about him from day one, you
Yeah.
bitch.
Like, honestly, some of the most fun guys I've hung out with, granted, we did have different values, but very intelligent, a lot of fun to be with, good friends, back in the day when we were in the same social circles and everything, were shorter than me. And I think I've said this before. I've dated guys that were enough smaller than me back when I was younger and stronger that I could pick them up. There were at least 2 guys that I went out with that I could pick up and carry if I wanted to. Wouldn't have done it just because I think that would have embarrassed them. But when I worked as a nurse's aide, I could lift a person my size. And these guys were shorter and slimmer than me, and I was pretty slim. So, there's absolutely nothing supporting women's treatment of shorter men like they're somehow lesser, but they still do it. Right?
Shorter men live longer.
Really,
By the way, so if you want a man who outlives you, then get yourself a short man. I know I'm saying that in vain. You're not going to
Yeah.
go for it.
Well, you know, I mean,
you'd
if
rather have a tall man than a short man with 5 years longer lifespan.
Yeah, you'd rather die alone after your tall man dies. But you know, it just, there's a lot of things about this that women don't consider when they treat men the way they treat them, and when they discuss abuse as if it only happens to women. And you know, like that's one, you know, she would humiliate him because he was short. She would humiliate him because, you know, he wasn't rich. She would get into arguments with him about money and throw heavy knickknacks and iron skillets and, you know, lamp fixtures, and it just, like, whatever was at hand. And the whole time she's yelling at him in this cartoonish, high-pitched Minnie Mouse voice, which just made it surreal when you saw them fight. You would expect a taller woman to have a deeper voice, but she didn't. But in any case, like, you know, that type of thing, people ignore it when it happens, or people treat it as comical, or like, to me, if I'd have been in his position, that would have been terrifying, right? But he got ribbed about it instead. And, you know, so men experience trauma twice. And I think that should be a clue to the second thing that we're gonna note that men experience. But we'll go on here. He experienced emotional violence without knowing it until much later a friend described what he had gone through. That should tell you also. He says, I would strive to become what she wanted, but when I did, she would again flip the script. My husband's ex-wife used to do that to him. He says, I laugh now, but my esteem was so shattered that I would find myself on Google looking for answers, wondering why I was never good enough. The survey also indicated that 8% of male participants disclosed experiencing physical violence, with 6% of the survivors experiencing it within 12 months before the survey was conducted. The report defines physical violence as slapping, beating, choking, or attacking with a knife or gun, among others. So I'm going to point out, this is from the report by Jennifer Langen Richton Rolling and her partners. About 2/3 of domestic violence is two-way, where one partner initiates and the other partner hits back. The other 1/3, 70% of it, is female-perpetrated, right? And that means 70% of abused partners who don't retaliate with violence are men. And when you look at that study, you find that about 16% of relationships that responded to that survey had domestic violence, right? So less than 1 in 4 had domestic violence. It was pretty on par with this. The amount of physical violence and the amount of men experiencing violence in Kenya is not unusually. It's not low. It's not unusually high. It's pretty on par with what we see in the West. And again, about 2/3 of that is two-way, and when it's one-way, about 70% of it is just female-perpetrated. I hope I'm going to pronounce this last name right. For Mike, I believe this is Radamo or Radamo. Society has trivialized violence against men, at times making a mockery of it. Up until my partner's brother was assaulted by his wife, she would laugh when she heard of men who were battered by their wives, in some instances saying they deserved it. But all that changed the day we were called and told that my in-law who was attacked by his wife had been found in a pool of his blood, and there were chances that he would not make it.
Jesus Christ.
Right. We hear all the time that female-perpetrated violence is not as serious of an issue as male-perpetrated violence, because men are bigger and stronger, which isn't necessarily true. Like I said before, there were at least 2 guys I dated in my history that I could pick up, right? And we hear that, and we hear that women are less capable of violence, but not in this instance.
Well, see, he's a man, so he can kill you. That's just natural. That's the natural order of things. It's a man. Obviously, he can just kill you.
And this all changes the bigger the government gets.
Yeah.
Because governments, particularly in the West, are entirely behind women and all their needs and desires and whatnot. So any given woman has the power of the state behind her, and all a man has is himself.
Yep.
And maybe his closest friends and family, but a woman has the power of the state, and the state is more powerful than any man, thousands of times more powerful than any man. And this is why it's interesting that it's Kenya where we're talking about, for all the stuff we say about the difference between the West and the rest of the world. Kenya is, as I understand it, Kenya's a pretty rich and prosperous country, certainly by African standards. It's a pretty rich and affluent country, so it would make sense that this phenomenon would appear, at least in any given reports, before it appears anywhere else. You're unlikely. Feminism's unlikely to take off in Eswatini or Somalia or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, because they can't afford it. in countries where people are fighting for their lives every day, they can't afford to let women just emotionally abuse men because they feel like it. It only happens in prosperous countries. In direct contradiction to this idea that was even espoused by Christopher Hitchens once, that when you give women all the possible powers of I don't know what the word is, but when you let women do whatever they want, it doesn't lift a country out of poverty. It's when a country is lifted out of poverty, they can afford to indulge in the human nature of gynocentrism.
Yeah.
And that's why this sort of thing is obviously going to happen in Kenya before it happens in Lesotho.
And honestly, in countries like the Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where you find feminism is not among the common woman, right? It's not among the farmers. It's not among the women in cities. It's usually imported, and it's centered in areas where government or world organizations provide charitable assistance to the people of the nation, and then feminists from other countries will swoop in and create a feminist version or a feminist niche within that organization or that organized charitable giving. And they will exclude men from the benefits as quickly as they can. And then they will start trying to teach the women of the area that's being assisted to exclude men and to control whatever benefits are available. They create like a female mafia in those areas. But the women themselves, if you gave them a description of feminist dogma, would say, well, that's a strange fantasy. That doesn't describe reality. This is the way men behave. What are you talking about? They'll still take that control. They'll still view themselves as superior stewards of resources. I mean, a lot of times it's because since their men take the risk of acquiring and protecting resources, it becomes the woman's responsibility to steward the resources in their home, in their communities, and so on. So it's sort of a natural extension for them to accept, yes, women should steward this resource as well. And the feminists really take advantage of that. But in a place like Kenya, then you start getting, like, there's a pretty thriving feminist subculture in Kenya. And, like, I've heard from more than a few men from Kenya about that and how it's impacted, discussions on legislation and how it's impacted social standards and so on. So, but yeah, this level of violence, I've seen this level of violence from women. I've been subjected to attempts at that level of violence from women, and I've seen men. I've known men with scars, like physical scars, from that level of violence by women. I have a friend who was convicted of assault for stopping a woman's second attempt at stabbing him in the throat with a sharp object. Because he was too rough. He was too vigorous in his effort to stop her. Basically, she came at him like a maniac, and he instinctively, like, rabbit punched her in the jaw. That was it. He didn't beat her, he didn't kick her, he didn't break any bones. He really didn't even leave a bruise. He just surprised the shit out of her, and then her friends restrained her. She was high, and that was the end of that. Like, they don't even know what she had taken. She was fine. She was normal. She went in the bathroom. She came back out of the bathroom, and she appeared to have had some sort of psychotic break. So it had to have been some weird screwed up street drug that either was badly made or was badly incompatible with her system. And she was violent toward everybody in the house. But she pressed charges against him, probably because she was embarrassed. And he got convicted of assault for that. She didn't get convicted of anything, right? He wasn't even allowed to press charges against her for trying to stab him. Yeah. It was quite a, and that's in the U.S., right? But, this found in a pool of his own blood, and he might not have survived, right? She was worried that he might not have survived. And that's what it took, right? Women won't even acknowledge this until it's one of their own, right? A guy that's close to them, someone they love and care about. And then suddenly, oh gosh, this actually does happen.
Mm-hmm. Which is, makes it really weird, especially like in a country like India, who we also know has very high rates of violence against men by the women that they're involved with.
They'll do it right out in public.
Yeah, and there's I don't know what the percentage of women is to men, but it seems like they really care all about what the women have to say. And, women have fathers and brothers and uncles that go through this. You would think that more women would be speaking up for the men in their lives who go through this and worse. But
when I look at my history with this, right, I knew there were some women that were jerks. Didn't realize the law supported them until I started seeing its effect on the guys around me. But if someone had started talking to me about it when I was a teenager or something, before I knew about any of this stuff, I wouldn't have ignored it. I said, "Oh, can you show me, some examples, some evidence?" And what they would have been able to. And when they did, I'd have been like, "Well, this is terrible. We've got to start contacting our legislators. We can't have this. This is a violation of civil rights. Equal treatment under the law. That's enshrined in our Constitution." Being male is not excluded from that. Everybody deserves equal treatment. But it took, you don't see stuff like that. You don't know about stuff like that, about the letter of the law and how it can be abused. If you don't exhibit that kind of behavior yourself, if you're not going to have those type of intentions, you don't expect something like that until you see it happening. So that would be one thing. But I don't understand women that act like abuse men experienced must have been deserved. Well, he must have done something to deserve it. Once you grow up and you're an adult, by the time you get to that point, you should have learned that peaceful negotiation with the people around you is a superior means of navigating controversy and disagreement and so on, than trying to use violence and force and underhanded things like manipulation. But apparently a significant majority of women don't learn that lesson. Apparently they don't grow up in an environment where there are consequences for those behaviors that are a deterrent and rewards for, or at least sufficient rewards for learning to negotiate, learning to navigate social situations in a way that is fair to everybody, amicable treatment of everybody, where you come out of it and you're still friends. That doesn't apparently reward them, but I don't know. So they end up being violent. It goes on to say sexual violence, which the study refers to physically as being forced to have intercourse without consent, is less frequently reported by men. It affects 6% of men, with 4% of victims having suffered in the year leading up to the survey. So they're defining sexual violence slightly differently than a lot of Western nations. A lot of Western nations got very OCD about how they're described. And the underlying reason for that is Mary P. Koss trying to write a definition for rape that would exclude female perpetration against male victims. So her definition, instead of just describing sexual intercourse without consent or against the will of the victim, goes through and describes every form of sexual intercourse except being forcibly enveloped. So if men are subjected to forced coitus or forced fellatio, it's not considered rape under her definition. Lastly, men reported economic violence, defined as the restriction, exploitation, or sabotage of one's ability to acquire, access, or maintain economic resources. 6% of men said they have experienced economic violence, while 2% reported experiencing such violence in the 12 months before the survey. And this is something that I think a lot of people might think of as normal behavior. And you've heard of the couples where the husband comes home from work on payday and hands his paycheck over to his wife, and she manages all the money and gives him an allowance.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And when it's the other way around, when the husband manages all the money and tells the wife how much extra there is to spend, we are told that's abuse. Right? If she doesn't get to decide how much she's going to spend. And part of that is if the husband says, well, you can't get a job, no wife of mine is going to have to work, things like that, and then limits her spending, then it's legitimate in that he's preventing her from obtaining more money when she wants to spend more money, unless he's required to pay her taxes and he's accountable for any economic failure of hers, and then it's not legitimate to call that abuse because he's responsible, so he should be able to make the decision. But when women do it, when women expect the husband to bring home his paycheck and hand it over, and then turn around and say, well, here's your allowance. Well, they have full control over the money. People think, well, that's the right way to handle it.
Or when they complain because, the husband's working too much, but he wants to, maybe advance his career, which means he might have to spend more time in the office or take trips away and things like that. Well, you need to spend more time at home, and then he can't take those moves to further his career. He's got to stay at the level that he's at because it's a regular 9 to 5 and that's the hours that she can deal with, because then they have me time,
right?
Or excuse me, we time, us time. It's bullshit.
Yeah. There's another form of economic abuse that women engage in that men don't necessarily do as much. And people don't necessarily think of it as a form of abuse. Right? You're married. You've been married for 5 or 6 years, and one day your wife comes to you and says, "Well, we got to file bankruptcy." And you don't understand why, because you bring in enough between the two of you, whether it's just you working or you and her working, that your income more than covers all of the bills you know about. And that's when you find out that she has taken out credit cards in both of your names and maxed them out and can't pay the minimum payments anymore from the mad money that she has every month. And now she wants to declare bankruptcy to get rid of the credit card debt. And, that's another one that my husband's ex-wife did. And when we got married, she had also overdrawn their joint checking account so many times that we had to have a joint checking account. He couldn't have an account just in his name. So that, we do our finances where, we're in the same bank and we just move money back and forth to make sure one of us can make a solid payment on any bill that comes up, and we just discuss it and we settle on what we're going to do, and then we do it, right? But she didn't talk to him about expenditures, and a lot of women don't. They just go out and spend money like it's leaves from trees, and then turn around and get upset when their income and their husband's income doesn't cover it. Right? And that's how a lot of fights about money that ultimately lead to divorce get started. And it is abuse to run up a shitload of debt in your partner's name without your partner's consent just because you can, or to destroy your partner's credit rating, or to destroy your partner's rating as a good bank customer by engaging in abuse of your partner's line of credit or access to an account. And a lot of women just do that, and men just tolerate it, and they don't think of themselves as victims of economic abuse. But if they did that to their partners, then they would get criticized for engaging in economic abuse.
Mm-hmm. It's crazy. It's one of the main reasons why I think that people should just maintain their own bank accounts. Even if you're married, do not commingle your funds. It's just not a good idea. It's best to just come up with a plan on how you're going to manage things and move forward like that. I don't know. Well, I know why more people don't do it, because, they feel like the women will complain, "Oh, you don't trust me." Or it's the romantic, we're doing this together. And it just never ends up that way,
Yeah. Well, and another one is her earnings are her money, but his earnings are their money.
Our money, exactly.
Yeah. When I got married to my husband, that's one of the things I talked to him about, because it's a lot of where we came from, both of us family-wise, where we came from, there's a lot of tradition around both partners working. Whether it's like I come from a community that's surrounded by farms. Nobody lives on a farm and doesn't work. There's no such thing as a non-working farmer. They work hard, and they work long hours. Right? This is not a leisurely. You don't undertake family farming if you do not have a level of industry in you to do it. And when you get into more of the like town-dwelling parts of the community, usually you would see women shaping their work-life balance around making sure that their kids are cared for. You know, as my generation, we had latchkey kids, but there was always like my neighbor kid would come over to our house all the time, and his mom and my mom were friends, and the lady next door to them, she was friends with both of us, both my mom and our friend's mom, and all of the kids on the block were friends. And so there was a lot of communication. If the neighbor kid had an emergency, he knew, 3 or 4 houses he could go to. If one of the neighbors saw a problem, like, well, he's peeing outside, or somebody just went into that house that doesn't look like they belong there, then the kid got help, right? An adult immediately was right there on the situation. But today, like when my kids were little, I had 2 friends that I traded childcare with, so that our kids having their childcare time were basically just having what a lot of our generation calls play dates, right? And that is how a lot of our generation was used to. And so I had to explain in the start of our relationship, I'm a little bit of a workaholic. Right now I have 2 jobs. And at that time, that was the truth. Right now I have 2 jobs. And before we got married, I added a 3rd job at that time. And I had 3 jobs for a long time. And I just do. I work a lot. And I was like, if I'm going to do that, then I'm going to be, we're not doing my money is my money and his money is our money, right? If his money is our money, my money is our money. So we'll talk about the bills, and we'll figure out from the total how much goes into the bills, and then we'll figure out from the total how much we have left that we can spend on things that are not bills. And he was cool with that. Some guys are more traditional about it and would be embarrassed, and some guys would be ecstatic. And he was like, whatever you want to do, I'm comfortable with it. And that was an important conversation to have, right? But yeah, when we talked about all of the different aspects of it, childcare, and if one parent was going to be doing more of that than the other, and so on, and like that was another one, because he didn't want to be not as involved as me. He wanted to be equally involved, which I think most dads do. And I think a lot of moms cut them out of that by assuming that they can't do it. So that was something that, again, women engage in a sort of an abuse with. They hog the children. I don't have a better way to put that. You love your kids, you want to be close to your kids, you want to be involved in everything about their development, right? But you also love your partner, and it's very special to be involved together in every aspect of their development, the kids' development, and to get to talk about it and celebrate it and that kind of thing. But a lot of women exclude the father, and they hurt him by doing that. And they miss out on the fun of watching him watch the kids develop and seeing his pride and his joy in their growth and his influence on them and everything. It's really unfair. And I think a lot of the same women who, her money is her money, but his money is their money, the kids are her kids, not their kids. You know, like those, it's sort of a well-rounded level of selfishness, I guess, and solipsism. So, Simon Machiri recalled how his uncle's life, now a divorce, spiraled out of control. When he lost his job, he and the wife agreed to put her car into the taxi business. When the business had taken off and it was doing well, they had a disagreement and she sold the vehicle. He has never recovered. These days he drinks cheap liquor day and night.
Wow.
She got revenge on him by cutting her nose off to spite her face.
It's like how women put the kid's father on child support, and then the second he fucks up, she calls the police, knowing that he's gonna get in trouble, or if he's late with the payment, that they can revoke his driving license, and that will. Then how's he gonna earn
help
a
him pay.
living? Yeah, I mean, it's so stupid. But they don't think; they just react, and it's all like, "Well, here I'm gonna get you." This tit for tat. It's so bullshit. Women are stupid. I'm sorry.
It's like they didn't grow out of. You know how some kids, when they're little, and they get mad at something mom or dad, did, like a rule set, or being told no is another when they get mad being told no. And they, in the midst of their temper tantrum, they threaten to harm themselves. They put their arm in their mouth. I'm gonna bite, and start hitting their heads on the wall and stuff. And of course, the response to that is to basically not look at all upset about it. Well, that's going to hurt you. It's not going to hurt me. You have at it. Chow down.
Yeah.
Your arm might be delicious for all I know. Can I have a bite? And then they won't do it anymore because it doesn't have the effect they want. So I think a lot of women do shit like this, where they cut their nose off to spite their face, right? Or in this case, their partner. I think they might have grown up in households where their parents freaked out if they threatened to harm themselves, right? Or they just don't learn. They're not smart enough to learn from that. Like, oh, nobody is punished but you when you do that. Doesn't ever get communicated to them one way or another. The findings of the report bring attention to the need for increased awareness and support for male victims of intimate partner violence. Now we're going to get more into the second thing. Stigma. Right? So probably everybody's figured this out by now. Men in Kenya who experience partner violence are stigmatized heavily. This is true in the United States, this is true in the UK, it's true in Canada, it's true in India, right? It's true everywhere. And it's historically true. Historically, there was a type of community response to partner abuse called a skimmington ride. This was also a response to adultery, a response to conflict in the home, if the couple was too noisy, things like that. But a skimmington ride, in particular, when it was in response to abuse, if a man abused his partner, they would put him on a donkey, backward, ride him through town, and everybody would hit him with things like, the device you use. It's like a wire whisk, but a great big one, to beat dust out of rugs, or they'd hit him with brooms and throw rotten vegetables at him and shit. And of course, if his wife was abusive, well, then they would put the husband riding backwards on the donkey and ride him through town and ridicule him and hit him with things and throw rotten fruit at him. Again, the stigma, that's basically stigmatization of abuse victims who happen to be men. That's a universal kind of thing. They're supposed to be bigger and stronger. They're not allowed to be abusive themselves, but somehow, without being abusive, they're expected to control an abusive wife. Societal stigma surrounding male victims of violence remains a barrier to open conversations and support systems for those facing trauma, and hinders the creation of a safer and more inclusive environment for all. According to the KDHS report, men are least likely to seek help from their friends when they suffer physical violence. Some 48% of men will turn to their families for help, 26% to the police, but only 16% will turn to their friends. In the country, there are also limited safe houses for men who experience sexual and or physical violence. According to the National Shelter Network, out of 6 government-run safe houses and 56 private ones, so a total of 62 shelters, only 5 cater to the needs of male survivors.
That's more than we got. The hell?
So even in a country that isn't totally run by feminists, there's obviously a very big organized feminist movement there. But 1 out of 12 shelters helps male survivors there. And we don't know for sure. I know in the United States there are many people who will say, well, all the shelters cater to male victims. Well, no, they don't.
No, they do not.
They say they help men, but when men call them for help, they are referred to perpetrator programs.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not how you help a victim. So, John, I think this is probably easy to pronounce, John Muckabane, or maybe it's Muckabani, I don't know, a social worker, in a previous interview with Nation.Africa, lamented the unequal effort put forth by government and non-government agencies to combat violence. He asked that they consider and address the needs of male survivors in their overall approach of prevention and support. Society has focused on raising awareness of violence against women at the expense of men, despite the fact that men undergo similar challenges. Balance efforts in supporting all survivors instead of focusing on women only. So that's the end of that article.
Who is this guy? And can you immigrate here? Look, we need your efforts over here, man. I mean, well, obviously you need it there too, but
Kenya probably has a men's rights movement.
That's I'm really blown away. I mean, I'm waiting for the feminist twist in this entire article, but there really is none. The only thing that I would say is that stood out to me is when they were talking about sexual violence, which refers to the study of physically as being forced to have intercourse without consent. I mean, that's rape, right? Why make the distinction as to calling it sexual violence? It's rape. Call it what it is.
A lot of countries have removed the label rape or just never used the label rape in their legislation for rape. I know Canada, I think, doesn't use it at all. And there are a lot of states also in the United States that don't use it.
Hi, Britbong here. I also exist.
Yeah, then there's Britain that differentiates by gender. Right, so if a man is convicted of a crime after physically holding someone down and forcibly engaging in coitus on them against their will, he's labeled a rapist as part of his punishment. He carries the stigma of being a rapist as part of his punishment. But if a woman does exactly the same thing to somebody that is smaller and weaker than her, or intoxicated, or anything else that makes it possible for her to hold that person down against his will and forcibly engage and perform coitus on his body against his will, she doesn't have to carry the stigma of being labeled a rapist, because when she's charged with that crime, they just refer to it as a sexual assault. And we are told by the UK government that this is equal punishment, because both the woman and the man can be subject to the same length of prison sentences for committing that crime. And they can be put on perpetrator lists, and they can be put on probation after they get out of imprisonment. But the courts don't treat it the same because it doesn't have the same label. And so women will get lighter sentences. When they get out, they may have shorter probation. The judge may decide that they don't need to go on a list, and their neighbors don't get warned that they behave this way, and they don't carry the stigma. They don't have rapist attached to their name. So, obviously, if that's not an important part of the punishment, the UK needs to eliminate the word rape in its law and just make both sexes subject to the same law that women are subject to, right?
Or at the very least, you need to make sure you identify as a woman before you get raped by a woman. Yeah, this involves some degree of clairvoyance, but have the clairvoyance to have that clairvoyance, gentlemen.
There you go.
And you'll be fine.
Actually, it's specific to the penis, isn't it? Like, if you have a penis, then you can be called a rapist. But if you don't have a penis, you can't be called a rapist. If you
identify as having a vagina,
yes,
even if you have a penis, well, would surely complicate things enough.
Well, there's at least one hospital.
Just scratch their heads and go, I don't know what we do.
There's at least one hospital in the UK that will tell the victim that it didn't happen. It can't have happened because there are no men on that floor. And that's there's a Telegram article about that. Actually, Parliament had to sit and listen to that discussed because of that incident. So, there's a link up here above the ads. No, it's not above the ads. It's below the ads. There we go. And it's why Agimbi men suffer in silence at the hands of wives. Now, this is an old article that I'm going to open up here. This is from 2022. So this isn't, and I'm not going to go through the whole article because it's already after 8 o'clock. But I wanted to point out, this isn't a new discussion necessarily. It's something that at the very least, there've been articles about it for a year, and it also speaks to the stigma. And so I'll start this out and I'll read the first paragraph. Jackson Mutuma suffered in silence as his wife hurled insults and at times resorted to physical assault, accusing him of not taking care of the family. This went on for several months. One day he returned home in the evening and found his house empty. His wife of 8 years had taken all their belongings and gone to her parents. The couple lived at I think this is Mutati, but it might be Mutuati, Agimbi North, whose main economic activity is the Mira trade. So I've read about Mira. It is it's a plant that, like in South America, people do this with the plant that cocaine comes from. You chew on the leaves, and it has a much lower effect on the body than when people extract cocaine from the plant and snort it. This isn't cocaine, but it does have effects where you chew on the leaves, and I think it's a stimulant. And there's actually some research that shows that it has some benefits when used that way, actual health benefits when used that way. So it's not like cocaine in that cocaine does the opposite, whereas this helps with like weight management and prevents heart conditions. So that's the main economic activity of this country. He says his Mutuma says his Mira business was hit hard by drought to a level he was not making any money, hence the abuse. Right? Can you imagine? Like, if a guy started abusing his wife because she didn't have a job or wasn't bringing in enough money from her job. And one of the things that makes the use of the word pimp disparaging is that they abuse the women that they're supervising if they don't make enough money. That their relationship, their business relationship with the women is forced. This sounds like a forced business relationship in the marriage. Make enough money to support me or I'll abuse you. So, out of concern for his 2 daughters, aged 3 and 8, he followed his wife to her parents' home, a move he regrets as it marked the beginning of a life in hell. I don't know why I decided to live at her parents' home, but I think I madly loved my children and feared they would be mistreated. Now, that statement is something that Deborah Pawnee pointed out in her research on coercive control. She found that a lot of men remain in abusive partnerships because they are afraid that if they leave, their children will be targeted next.
This is another point that Toe Rogan made once. Well, if you think your children are being mistreated by their mother, then why would you leave the relationship?
Yeah.
Well, largely because you're fucking forced to, Joe. Largely because you have no choice in the matter. That if you stayed, they would probably abuse them even more, and so you're very much between a rock and a hard place. So, I guess if all else being equal, I guess you would leave, so that at least you don't get mistreated, and maybe in your absence they would get mistreated less, because a woman who hates her husband will abuse her children more than a woman who has no husband to hate. Possibly not, because they'll have to take their hate out on someone, but possibly so, because what they really hate is men, and you being a man, you're the one stroking her hatred, which is obviously your fault, and so on and so forth.
Well, and if she's abusive, and she's psychologically abusive, and she knows you love your kids, then she'll make sure you see them hurt.
Mm-hmm.
All of this would be solved if there just wasn't a fucking government to stoke all of this fiery nonsense.
Well, and
But Mike, they're here to help.
Yeah, that's the other thing. Government is part of the reason why men do end up leaving. Women can use government to kick a man out of his home. Right?
Mm-hmm.
They allege abuse. They allege sexual violence. They divorce him and get restraining orders. Men don't get a choice. If your wife says he abused me, and the government says, well, now you have to leave. If you don't leave, the police will remove you, and they will give you a new place to live, a very small one with bars. So, all a woman has to do is say you hit her to get you out of your house. It doesn't even have to be true. She doesn't have to prove it. In a lot of states in the United States, domestic violence law has a punitive response to men accused of domestic violence before any evidence at all is presented.
And it's so telling that men don't understand this, even when it's happening to their friends.
Mm-hmm.
They don't understand it until it happens to them, and then it's too late.
Yeah, and they're powerless in that situation. And so let me snag this super chat before it disappears. And there we go. So we have, it goes on, I don't know why I decided to live at her parents' home. But I think I madly loved my children and feared they would be mistreated. But then she started coming home with different men. So again, putting her disloyalty on display, right?
Wait, to the parents' home?
To the parents' home. So in front
Wow.
of his in-laws, his wife put her disloyalty on display. And her mother encouraged her.
Mm.
He says, I could not stomach this. I left and rented a house at a shopping center, but then they started torturing my children and chased them away in the middle of the night. I decided to live with them in my small room. So he ended up having to take custody of the children. And then we have more. At one point, some neighbors called the police and falsely accused him of attempting to kill his child, but Miss Jennifer Cather, a child protection volunteer in the area, saved him moments before he was arrested. Mutama is one of the men who have suffered gender-based violence. They call it gender-based violence, which I think is a dumb way to describe it because it's not gender that makes this happen. It happens in lesbian relationships, it happens in gay relationships, it happens in straight relationships. Obviously, there's not one sex that is just all perpetrators and the other all victims. Right? Although women do get away with it more, and so women do perpetrate more, even though feminists say that they don't.
So it's
not gendered.
It's not even misandry.
Right.
Given that lesbians can do it to other lesbians. It's whatever women can get away with because the government will let them get away with it. I don't even know what the word is. Well, I guess it's gynocentrism.
Yep. So here's the point I wanted to get to in this, because remember we said about the percentages and everything. That's what we know about, right, from the research. That's what was disclosed. So he's one of the men who has suffered domestic or intimate partner violence. In a society where male victims are ridiculed for being weak, he opted to keep to himself. Right? And there's an asterisk by these men's names because obviously they're using a different name in the article than the man's real name. Because
is John Muriungi the African equivalent of John Doe? Is that what's going on?
Possibly, right? And, the next victim, his experience being more brutal. Besides his former wife assaulting him on several occasions, she filed trumped-up charges against him at a police station where he was remanded and tortured. She left me with our 6-month-old baby and went to fend for herself in towns where she engaged in sex work. After 4 years, she came back and took away the child, accusing me of planning to harm her and the child. Police did not want to hear my side of the story, so I was put in a cell and beaten up. And before we say, well, that's Africa, police do that in Africa. Have you ever seen them arrest a guy accused of wife beating in the United States? They are deliberately rough in ways that they are not deliberately rough with guys who are accused of, say, robbing a convenience store at gunpoint. Because they feel like they're getting revenge, for the woman, and I've seen it directly.
You don't even have the right to remain silent. You can remain silent as a fucking insect, and they will still arrest you.
Yep.
In fact, if you can't give your testimony, then they will assume by default that you did everything wrong. Because the woman's there screaming that you did everything wrong, and you've got nothing to say in your defense.
Yeah.
Miranda rights are a fucking farce. They never really applied.
Yep. And then on top of that, it doesn't matter whether you're silent or not. You could provide them with evidence that you didn't commit the crime, and in many jurisdictions, they still have to arrest you. They can't take, I couldn't have committed the crime for an answer. And so, in that case, if you can prove your innocence to the police, they're not rough with you. And one of the experiences that 7 Years in Hell guy had, he lived in one jurisdiction, but she reported to another jurisdiction. So the way that had to be handled was his home jurisdiction came and arrested him and then had to hand him over to City of Dayton. And City of Dayton was prepared for a fight with him. They got out of their car with, God, I can't think of what they're called. I don't think it's called billy clubs. I think they're just called clubs because they're not the, one handle stick. It's actually got like two handles, and you're supposed to be able to hold it like a brace and brace it with your arm. But they had those out. Like they were going to have to subdue him. And so before getting him out of the car, the police from his jurisdiction got out and conversed with Dayton. Baton, thank you. And said, this guy is not going to be a problem. He didn't commit the crime. We've seen evidence that he didn't commit the crime. We've seen evidence that she is a serial false accuser. He's just going to go with you and endure the process and then go home. And so the Dayton guys put their stuff away and just, took him to his night in hell, and that was the end of the animosity by the police. But if they had believed that he was actually a wife beater, then they would have been super rough with him, and they would have been super hostile toward him. And of course they sent two big men to get him because they want to intimidate him. And that's probably a worldwide thing. Wherever there is legislation that determines that local police must deal with domestic violence situations, that phenomenon exists. Miss Catherine says the two men would have been punished for the wrongs they did not commit if she did not intervene. She says many men suffer in silence, especially in Mara-growing areas of Agimbi. When the business is affected by, for instance, drought and the recent ban on export to Somalia, their incomes significantly reduce. Ms. Catherine says, reduced incomes breed animosity as some women feel that their husbands are not doing enough to provide for their families. She says most people believe that only women undergo GBV, domestic violence, and society frowns on men who are beaten by their wives, so to avoid the ridicule, men bottle it up, with some resorting to suicide.
Much like they did, in the West back in the day when it was even more patriarchal than it is now.
On the last bit that I'm going to get into with this article is we've talked about police complicity in the US, in the UK, and Canada, where they view domestic violence as, through the training, the Duluth model training that they get under their various versions of the Violence Against Women Act. And so if they go into a situation and there's conflict, they immediately assume the husband must be the perpetrator, the wife must be the victim. The wife can't be a perpetrator, or if she is a perpetrator, it can't be taken seriously. And they will not arrest, often. They will not arrest the woman if she's a perpetrator. They will arrest the man if he's defended himself. They will tell the man to get out of the house. They will tell the man to get the woman some help. Right? They'll make him responsible for her behavior. And they will not offer any kind of resources to domestic violence victims who are male. Muriungi really suffered because the woman said she was ready to spend money on police officers to punish him. But I confronted her and asked why she was doing that, yet he was the father of her child, and she got ashamed, Mrs. Cather said. And this is something that at least is superior there. Women around here do not get ashamed. If a woman can pay off cops to mistreat her husband in any way, and someone says, "How dare you? This is the father of your children," she'll just turn around and call him a deadbeat. Right? That's ingrained in our society now. So at least in this culture, in Kenyan culture, some women are embarrassed when it's pointed out to them that they're attacking the father of their children. The officer termed it sad that police officers who should protect victims of abuse were used to intimidate Muriungi. She said when she pointed out to the police that Muriungi was the one being beaten up by his wife, they laughed at him.
Imagine that.
Wow.
As for Mutuma, I spoke to the assistant county commissioner who had been told of the incident and requested to accompany police officers who were going to arrest him. But when he came with a pack of, I don't know what unga is, and the children were happy in his presence, I knew he was not the aggressor, she said. So this is another one. Like, here we have the same thing. And yeah, Derek Workman has pointed out, no, in the U.S. they don't have to pay the cops. But sometimes they can. And corrupt cops are a thing in every country, right? But this particular type of corruption where they will be predisposed against an individual because of his gender and because of social norms in regard to gender and violence. I think that's pretty universal. And I think it's fair to say most of the time they don't have to bribe a police officer. But there are instances where someone with political power and money gets a better result because of those things as well. And if that person happens to be a woman, being a woman just contributes to that even more.
Incidentally, UNGA is United Nations General Assembly. I probably should have looked into that further than I did. But
well,
Google's
that's if it's an acronym.
No, it's not. But Google's not helping me out.
Yeah,
it just keeps telling me that it's United Nations General Assembly.
Yeah, that's definitely not something he brought home. So obviously, it's probably some sort of treat or a toy or something. But yeah, it's just to point it out, you know. What this shows is that even like a social worker is a government worker, right? So even when a government worker intervenes on behalf of men, you know, it takes a significant amount of pressure to get other government workers to stop mistreating them or to treat them equally to how they would treat, or even remotely similar to the level of compassion they would offer to a woman alleging abuse. Right? She described the situation to the police and told them who the real abuser was, and they laughed at the victim. So there we go. I just wanted to provide this example because, again, like we discuss this in Western terms all the time. We discuss this in, you know, white men are evil terms all the time, you know, based on feminists portraying white men as the worst people in the world. And yet here we have a country that is mostly black, where most of the men who are suffering this are black men married to black women. You know, it's their native country, and they're still experiencing the same cultural problems and the same legal problems that we see here in the United States, that we see in the UK, that we see in Canada, that we see in India, and, you know, and I will bet that if there is writing about men's experiences from any other country, you know, that there will be at some point, you'll be able to find articles with similar descriptions of similar issues, the same kind of treatment. Not only are a third of men in Kenya, and obviously men in, you know, other areas as well, but not only are they subject to abuse, but they're also subject to secondary abuse through stigma, through state practice of lack of compassion, indifference, or condemnation because they have been abused, right? And that's the situation all over the world. Until we change that, until we change social and legal indifference and animosity toward abused men, we'll continue to see women initiating violence. So I don't know if you guys have anything further to add.
I think we're both quite tired.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and get us into the super chats then. I have 2 super chats. Albert Nader Retro gave us $5 Canadian and said, best advice I heard a woman give wives: men don't marry their wives, they marry their girlfriends. So if you stop being his girlfriend, he'll find a new one.
Mhm.
You know, which it can be true, but you know, where I come from, if you stop being his girlfriend, he'll endure the rest of the marriage until you leave, and he'll be sad. Derek Workman gave us $2 and said, more likely abusers of any gender hate themselves. You know, honestly, most violent people are just immature and selfish. Like, they do not consider other people. I don't think they love themselves necessarily. They're just immature and selfish. And the level of immaturity determines how much violence they engage in. If they were raised in an environment that kept them from developing the ability to negotiate social conflict, or to navigate social conflict, then they're going to be violent.
Let it never be said that bullies are people who hate themselves. I'm sure it's sometimes the case, but it's just as often the case that bullies or abusers or evil people are people who love themselves. People who love themselves far more than they can love even anyone who reminds them of their selves. In fact, that's the nature of oikophobia. They can't love anyone who reminds them of themselves. They can only love themselves, and so they hate anyone who reminds them of themselves. And so they take all of their neurosis out on those who remind them of themselves, in virtue signaling faux favor of anyone who does not remind them of themselves. This sounds weird to anyone who doesn't know what oikophobia is, but to anyone who does, it makes perfect sense.
Yep.
Do you know what I mean?
Okay, got one more super chat. Albert Nader Retro gave us $5 and wants to know if Lauren forwarded his Thor, Love, and Thunder piece to me. Did you send me something and I missed it?
No, I don't know what he's talking about, Albert. I got his email address, but I don't know if he emailed me again.
Okay.
If that email was to ask me to forward something to you, I have not read that or done that. So
Okay. Well, it's all right because I suck at keeping up with my email anyway. So
oh God, me too.
Been better at it lately, but I'm gonna go back to sucking at it pretty soon because I don't have. One of the reasons that I was better at checking my email was that I've been communicating with my estate attorney for my parents' insolvent estate that I've been dealing with, and that was auctioned off, and the payments that go out to the creditors are being taken care of, so I only have a few things left to make appointments for and sign, and then I'm done dealing with that
Nice.
completely. And so then I will suck even more at checking my email because I won't be looking for emails from the lawyer. But yeah, I'll make sure you have my email address so you can forward it if you don't already have it. And let's see here. Oh, he says he sent it late this morning. Albert Nader Retro gave us $2 Canadian, says, I sent it late this morning.
Okay, yeah, I have not checked them today, so I will do that.
Now, where is my...
I have to say,
window with...
Lauren doesn't get paid for any of this shit.
No,
so she's under no obligation to do anything that any of you say. I mean, we love all of you, we do. But Lauren has like 5 hours of any given day to herself between doing her job and sleeping.
Yeah.
So, please don't fucking rely on her to pass on any information. Sorry, I'm not simping. I'm acutely aware of how difficult Lauren's general day is. So please don't, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will point out that as well. And then the other thing is, I really am not. I don't know if what I'm supposed to do with that. But I will tell you, if it's for me to read and put it in the blog, that's one thing. But if it's for me to read and respond to, the superhero comics are not the comics to write to me about. If you want to write to me about comics, and I haven't had extra money to spend on comics in quite a while, but at least not for myself. But in any case, like I'm more into like the horror comics and the weirdness, stuff that would have been in publications like Eerie and Scream and Spooky and Hammer's House of Horror comics, back in the day when those I don't think those have been published for decades, but not necessarily, like I watched superhero cartoons when I was growing up, but didn't get into the comic books as much. Maybe a little X-Men because my cousin had those comics and I would read them when I was visiting him, but not really, any of the other Marvel superheroes or the DC superheroes and stuff. And yes, Tyler Preston, I've heard of the comic Devilman, but it wasn't something that I ever read. Yeah, so anyway, it's not, there's not much for me to respond to in that. I like, if it's not stories about, that are like campfire ghost stories and stuff like that, I'm not really gonna be that great. Albert Nader Retro gave us $10 and said, "It's okay, Doc, you husbanding." I just have no other real way to contact Hannah directly. It's about a particular scene from one of the movies worth discussing for MRA reasons. Oh, you gotta, you can contact me on Twitter. So, but yeah, I'll give Lauren my email address. But like I said, contacting me personally by email is not a good way to get in touch with me. I see a lot more on Twitter, so or you can join our Discord and contact me that way. I'm in the Discord, and I'll see it. I may not see it the day that you contacted me, but I'll see it. So there's another one. I actually really suck at replying to my Discord messages too, so I get a lot more contact now than I used to, and I don't know if you guys understand. I do this and everything. I do broadcasting, live streaming, a lot of interaction on Twitter. But you'll notice, I use one social media a lot at a time, and will abandon all others. Any of you that follow me on Facebook will know that I maybe post once every couple of months, or I might post a few things in my brother's meme group and nowhere else, right? Social engagement is not my strong point. It's really not. Before I got involved in the men's rights movement online, I really kind of avoided social engagement quite a lot. I'm really kind of a loner and a introvert. So this is all abnormal for me. And it's not that I'm ignoring people, it's that seeking out contact and making an effort to communicate regularly with people in order to, as part of my camaraderie and connection with them, isn't natural for me.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, so it's kind of, people get mad when I'm not, in contact with them all the time, but to have 5 people in the same day reaching out to me is a lot. And so I have a rough time dealing with the fact that now it's more like 50. So at a time. It's just, I can deal with it. And I like getting into slap fights on Twitter, but you notice that sometimes when it gets really fast and furious, sometimes I'll walk away from that for a couple of days at a time too. You know, it's not healthy for me to do that. So I don't hand out my email address a lot because it's asking for people to get mad at me. Because I already know I'm going to fail to see your message, or I'm going to fail to respond to it in a timely manner when it's that. Albert Nader Retro gave us $2 Canadian and said Twitter banned me. If it was old Twitter before it became Elon Musk's Twitter, you might not still be banned, and you should check. And if you create a new account, I don't think that they will still ban you for ban evasion, even if they didn't unban your old account. So it's worth a try at the very least. But anyway, with that, I think I've got all of the super chats. We have an old super chow from Tuesday that we missed that I'm gonna read, and it's got nothing to do with this conversation, but it came in like right after the bell on Tuesday. So we were discussing I can't remember what we were discussing, but the topic of women having like realistic sex toys and realistic sex toy use and like satisfying stimulation and all that versus men, and the idea that fleshlights just can't compete with the real deal. And I, have no way of measuring that. But in any case, we got a response from Zapier, who gave us $5 and said, some Japanese fleshlights are extremely realistic, like they feel like the real thing, but they can't replicate the romance and intimacy. Not just about the feel. There's more to it than that. And the reason that I felt like it was important to highlight this is women think of romance as something that men do for women. They don't recognize the fact that it's important to men.
Yeah, I know this is hard for feminists to understand, but what men want is women. They don't just want a disembodied whole, no matter how fleshy it feels. Men need a brain attached to that particular organ. Men don't just love objects; they love women. It needs to be everything that a woman entails. It needs to be someone capable of loving. Dare I say, someone capable of loving him. And this is why a fleshlight will never do for a man what a dildo does for a woman. And I know that's difficult for a lot of women to hear.
Well, no, dildos don't do that either. It's still just
not for you, not for Hannah. They do it for a lot of feminists, for a lot of women who see men as nothing but a disposable cock/wallet. But men don't see women as a wallet. Men see women as women in a way that modern feminist women can never see men as men. They can only see men as a cock and a wallet. And this, I don't know if this is a contemporary thing or a fundamentally biological thing, but for whatever reason, men want women. Yeah, women just want objects. Present company accepted, obviously, but this is where we found ourselves socially.
I actually got into a little bit of trouble with my husband over this because he heard me say I wasn't a romantic person one night, and he was like, "Why do you tell people you're not romantic when you do things for me all the time to make me happy?" And I was like, "Well, you do things for me all the time to make me happy too," and he was like, "That's romance." Oh, okay. I was thinking about it. I grew up hearing about romance from other women who view it as ways that men show women that women have power over men. You can command their resources, you can command their attention, you can command their interest, right? And their ego, and therefore that's romantic. So they look at how much will he sacrifice, how much will he work, how much will he spend on me, right? How far will he go? Not how much joy does he take from my happiness. And my husband and I take a lot of joy in each other's happiness. It's a lot of fun to do things for your partner, to make your partner happy, and then see them experience that happiness while you're there enjoying their happiness. And it's not so much about service as it is about your investment and your mutual happiness in the relationship. So we ended up having a discussion about that it's very romantic when we show each other how much we want each other to be happy because we love each other. And, so I was thinking of you earlier today when I was in this other place and you weren't even around is romantic. To a person who is genuinely romantic. Not, I spent this much money on you, or I sacrificed this or that for you. Is you were on my mind. And sometimes there's, some that does involve like months of planning or working overtime to get the money to buy something that will make something that he does regularly that's hard easier. Because, you do that as a partner. You want your partner's life to be easy as opposed to hard. You want your partner's life to be happy as opposed to sad, right? So I always talk about the way my grandparents met. It's a horrible story. My grandfather worked for Chicago Bridge and Steel. He was a welder. And I believe that's the company he was working for when it happened. They dropped a concrete drainage ditch liner on his leg. And I mean, it landed on him from hip to toes. And crushed his ankle, broke his leg in several places. He was hospitalized, he was in traction and everything. And the romantic part of it is Grandma was the nurse that took care of him, and he fell in love. And they asked her out, and she agreed to go out with him. And over time, she fell in love too. And but obviously starting with a horrific accident. It took me a long time to see the romance of the falling in love over her caregiving. And my grandma was a very beautiful lady too. So much that when they lived in New York, she modeled hats for Saks Fifth Avenue. But in any case, she just had a really pretty face. And she was tall and very good shape and everything. And, obviously, Grandpa doing the work he did, he was in pretty darn good shape too. So they were a very handsome couple and everything. But it took me a long time to see the romance of it because just the horror of that initial accident just broke my heart knowing that happened to my grandpa. But so I always say, well, I didn't see it because I'm not romantic. No, I didn't see it because I don't get into what women usually describe as romance.
Yeah.
Right? And what I do get into, I didn't understand it as romance until my husband explained it to me. That is romance. Being invested in your partner's happiness and joy, taking joy in your partner's happiness and joy, and putting effort into that, and receiving that back from your partner as much as you contribute that. That's romance. So I'm romantic. I'm just not romantic like a girl.
Yeah.
But I'm not trans either. I had a guy on Twitter accuse me of that, like it was a crime, back when it was actually a violation of Twitter terms of service to misgender somebody. So, and and yeah, that's what Mangaka 92 describing on Rumble what I've always understood romance is to be is, a lot of sacrifice, time, planning, creativity, or circumstances like the way that Grandma and Grandpa met. And, today he would just get accused of sexual harassment. But yeah. So I don't know. That's just my outlook on it, though. Getting into the Super Chows, Meredith G gave us $5 and said, HBR Talk 277, honey for the badgers, and thanks for the conversation. Plain Dane gave us $5 and said, telomeres are like those plastic pieces at the end of your shoelaces. I think they're called aglets. Yes, they are. That keeps your shoelaces together. Telomeres are one of the things that keeps your DNA intact. There are drugs called that can lengthen. You left a word out there, so I don't know what the drugs are called. That can lengthen telomeres. One of them is called danazol. A more natural alternative that doesn't require prescriptions are omega-3 fatty acids, coenzyme Q10, PQQ, selenium, vitamin D3, 5-MTHF, and methylcobalamin. And I know about some of those. Like, I've known about the omega-3 fatty acid balance since before I had my son. Because I remember reading about that when I panicked about not being able to keep prenatal vitamins down and bought a book on nutrition and started obsessively making sure I was getting the right things, the right building blocks in, despite not being able to swallow pills that women have had babies for centuries without swallowing. So, but, and Q10, coenzyme Q10, yeah, that one I know about as well, simply because there's a lot of people that buy that, and I worked in a pharmacy for a while. The D3 thing, I think a lot of the health problems that we have today is our obsessive avoidance of the sun. Like, obviously, sunburn is bad, any kind of burn is bad, and obviously overdoing it is bad, but if you wear SPF 100 all the time, and, or never go outside, keep your skin covered all the time, you're not getting, your vitamin D isn't getting processed into your system properly because you need the sun for that. You can take supplements, but it isn't the same.
Get exercise, folks. Get exercise outside.
Mm-hmm.
It will kill two birds with one stone. You'll get vitamin D plus exercise. Do it today. I say this as someone who doesn't do it anything like as much as he should, but do as I say, not what I do.
Yeah, it also provides vitamin K, which is, and it, if you can't get a lot of exercise outdoors, eat broccoli with cheese on it, or drink vitamin D milk at least. And hemp seeds are a pretty good source of vitamin, if I remember right, vitamin K, if you're not getting sun. And they don't have THC, so if you're like me and you would get drug tested at work and get fired if you had that in your system, you can still have hemp seeds. Zapier gave us $10 and said, oh wait, this is odd because it starts with a 4, like a bullet point 4, but there's no 1, 2, and 3, so I don't know if our system ate part of your comment or not. So I apologize if I'm starting at the end of a long comment. Biased judicial system. The fictional government's courts are depicted as biased as they benefit financially from the police's confiscation of assets and money during victimless crime cases. The judges, prosecutors, probation officers, and private prisons all profit from this corrupt system. This raises concerns about their motivation and genuine commitment to serving justice. 5. Failure in crime prevention. Despite their claims of existing to stop crime, the Thin Blue Line's actions only occur after crimes have been committed. Their arrival is often ineffective in preventing crime. and the conviction rates are alarmingly low. This suggests that their existence is more of a facade intended to create an illusion of security rather than actively safeguarding the public. 6. Lack of accountability for misconduct. Instances of the thin blue line committing crimes, such as murder and theft, are met with lenient punishments, if not outright dismissal of charges. This creates a culture of impunity, where members of the gangs are not held to the same standards as ordinary citizens. The taxpayer's burden is unfairly increased when they have to pay for the consequences of the gang's unlawful actions. Overall, our government and its police represent a dystopian and corrupt justice system that fails to uphold the public's rights, prioritizes revenue over public safety, and perpetuates a culture of misconduct and lack of accountability. It serves as a cautionary tale highlighting the dangers of unchecked power and a compromised justice system. Yeah, it's all very good points. I wish I had seen the first 3 points. I don't know why the system ate them. But yeah, one thing that I pointed out I put a video up a while back, titled "We Have to Talk About, quote, male, end quote, violence." And I think I've expressed this before. I don't believe in male violence. There is violence that is, primarily female violence, in that it's engaged in by women for based on motivations that you don't see men having for violence. But most of the motivations for violence that we see labeled as male violence trace back to male-female relationships, one way or another. A lot of it is amassing and protecting resources for the women in one's life, or the women that one is considers oneself the protector and provider for. And a lot of it is protecting women, right? And the only thing that could be remotely considered violence that isn't motivated that by on women's behalf, one way or another, is when a man is violent in an attempt to control a woman. And that's the rarest type of violence that men engage in. Out of all the different types of violence that are attributed to men, that's the smallest amount, right? Whereas with women, the largest amount of violence that is attributed to women is relational violence between the woman and her partner, or the woman against her children, the woman against her parents, like the woman against her loved ones. There are other types of violence that women engage in. Women engage in conflict violence, and so do men, but that's not gendered, right? And women engage in abusive violence to the people around them that aren't necessarily related to them, that aren't necessarily part of their lives, and so do men. But again, that's not gendered, right? It's mainly just women don't engage in violence to get things for men, but men do engage in violence to get things for women. Right? And not that that's good violence, but my point is, we hear a lot about male violence. Most of it's not. It's just violence, and a lot of it is on women's behalf. But yeah, when we're talking about the police forces, one of the things I pointed out in that video is, if you describe police to somebody that's never heard of government, and never heard of government agencies, and never heard of government services, and you have to explain first, this is what the government is, right? Then you're explaining what the police force is. You're going to be describing a set of mercenaries that are paid for by tax dollars confiscated from the public under threat of force from said mercenaries, that are tasked with acting on behalf of government against the public, and with using detainment and prosecution as a means of not necessarily solving, but intervening in conflict between citizens. Right? That's probably the most accurate way you could describe them. They are mercenaries. They're official mercenaries. They're mercenaries with authority in your society, and they're, quote, respectable mercenaries that are presumed to be providing a service. And so we're all shocked when they are corrupt. But if you recognize that they are hired mercenaries, then you understand how they can become corrupt. So there you go. I don't know if anybody else has anything to add in regard to the cops.
No, let's end the show.
Then let's go ahead and end it. Thanks to everybody for listening. Thanks to my co-hosts for sticking out the long sausage. And thanks to everybody who works in the background to make HBR Talk happen. Good night, all.
Night, y'all.
Men's rights activists are machines, dude. Okay? They are literal machines. They are talking point machines. They are impossible to fucking deal with, especially if you have like a couple dudes who have good memory on top of that too. Holy shit, you're fucked.